It's against human nature, in a sense, to think about, your civilization ever dying out, ever being the target of future archaeologists. And if you wanted to create scenarios that would make anything like that possible, in the modern world, you usually involve nuclear weapons. Getting, to quote the old line, bombed back into the Stone Age. The story I want to talk about today would be the equivalent of people deciding to come out and start with their shovels, digging that Statue of Liberty out of the sand and trying to prop it back up again. And in the process, they are going to fuse their civilization with the old civilization of the Romans to create the basis for modern Europe. Historian Arthur Farrell explains, quote, "The fearsome Huns from the Asiatic steppes of South Russia, riding on their fat-headed, peculiar-looking plains horses, swept down on the Ostrogoths, living north and east of the Black Sea. This set in motion a chain reaction, as the Ostrogoths fled in panic westward against the Visigoths, who were driven hard against Rome's Danubian frontier." End quote. These peoples who've been agitated, shall we say, begin what history is called the migration of the peoples. The German name for it is the Völkerwanderung, the wanderings of the peoples. That's exactly what the Huns invasion did. Sets in motion chains of events that would prove ruinous for Rome. And in my mind, I always think of this painting done by André Durenceau about 40 or 50 years ago. But it's his take on Alaric's sacking of Rome in 410. And the image is wonderful and perpetual, and it's been famous and a favorite of painters forever. You can go back to the Romantic period in the late 1800s when nationalism was starting to catch on and see painting after painting after painting depicting the fall of Rome. And sometimes it's a different sacking later, but a lot of times it's this one in 410 where Alaric is sacking the city, and Durenceau gives you the, classic drama and the standard interpretation. In the backdrop of his painting, you see the glory of, the high water mark of the Roman Empire. And then began to recede, and it didn't recede because it wanted to. It receded because of these people who came in and brought it down. Ushered in centuries of darkness afterwards. And in the distance, you see the grandeur of Rome portrayed by Durenceau, including the government buildings in the background, which look exactly like the ones in Washington, D.C. After all, same architectural style. And then you can see down at the street level the streets of Rome, and they are pristine. And in the foreground, you can see the Romans themselves. And they all look like they just came out of some sort of beauty salon. The women have their hair up in what appears to be a blow-dried, sprayed sort of hairstyle. And they're wearing expensive jewelry and makeup, if I recall. And while that sounds fanciful, it's probably historical. And they're shown in snow-white, see-through togas that look very wealthy indeed. And the men look like they came out of a beauty salon, too. If you had told me that their nails had just been buffed and clear-coated, I would not be shocked. And they were laying at the feet of these Visigoths who appear to have just broken into the city. The city, by the way, with all those government buildings and fabulously wealthy villas in the backdrop of the painting, are in flames. Again, a symbol of the end of the high water mark of civilization. Visigothic king, I guess, is supposed to be the one in the center of the portrait, or maybe just your standard Visigoth. He had the standard hairstyle, the most classic, and that was, he probably had hair down to his waist, and he would pick it up and tie it in a knot on the top of his head. So he had kind of like a ponytail coming off the top of his head, but his hair was still so long past the knot that it all came down past his shoulders anyway. So sort of pulled up into a high knot, and then everything spills back down over the head. And, we've seen lots of evidence that these people were heavily tattooed, that they had piercings. I mean, it sounds a lot like an outlaw biker gang sort of look, doesn't it? And I've actually read some interesting historians' take on the mustache that's always shown on these Germanic conquerors and its importance. First of all, it's long often. Go see if you can see anywhere an image or a statue or a representation of a Roman or a Greek with a mustache. Now, André Durenceau's physical painting of what these Visigoths look like is correct. I mean, there's some writings that show exactly how the Romans viewed these, Germanic barbarian types. Now, Sidonius, writing at the time of what it was like to have German house guests, Quote, "Why do you bid me compose a song dedicated to Venus, placed as I am among long-haired hordes, having to endure Germanic speech, praising often with a wry face the song of the gluttonous Burgundian who spreads rancid butter on his hair? You don't have a reek of garlic and foul onions discharged upon you at every morning from 10 breakfasts, and you are not invaded even before dawn by a crowd of giants." End quote. Historian Chris Wickham is an expert on this era. Quote, "This is the key feature of events of the 5th century, at least in the Western Empire. Over and over again, in quotes, barbarian armies occupied Roman provinces, which they ran in Roman ways. So nothing changed, but everything changed. In 500 CE, the East was hardly changed. Indeed, it was experiencing an economic boom. But the West was divided into half a dozen major sections: Vandal Africa, Visigothic Spain and southwest Gaul, Burgundian southeast Gaul, Frankish northern Gaul, Ostrogothic Italy, and a host of smaller autonomous units in Britain and in the more marginal areas elsewhere. The larger Western polities were all ruled in a Roman tradition, but they were more militarized. Their fiscal structures were weaker, they had fewer economic interrelationships, and their internal economies were often simpler." End quote. This is the beginning of Europe's Statue of Liberty being buried in the sand moment, when the central authority disintegrates, and eventually in 476, the last Roman emperor sort of being shuffled off to retirement by a German warlord.